First light washed the ravine as the Rangers stepped into a kill zone between two ridgelines. Radio traffic collided in headsets, calls stacking into static while rounds chewed dirt. Every path downhill vanished under fire. The blast hit like a door slamming behind them. An RPG-7 detonated at the rear and sent rocks cascading, sealing their exit with a wall of debris. Dust filled mouths and lungs, while fragments skittered by boots. First, Lieutenant Mark Hensley pushed the order through the noise. Hold position. Find real cover, not concealment. Helmets low. Men slid behind stone that stopped bullets, not brush that only hid shapes. Sergeant Alex Ramirez tried to steal a firing angle up the right slope. High ground spat disciplined bursts that forced him back. Stone sparking inches from his face. He signaled no-go and reset the team's sectors. A Ranger spun down with a leg hit. SPC. Dana Brooks moved to the casualty. Tourniquet high and tight. Bleeding checked. Airway and respiration scanned. Circulation and head-to-toe reassessed by March. The soldier breathed. Shock managed behind real rock. SPC. Kyle Newen raised the antenna of his ANPRC 117G to a thin slice of sky. Terrain masking smothered the signal and only white hiss returned. ComSec locked the platoon net, so no outsider could ride their traffic. Close air support was a mirage. Ceiling sat low. The valley was too tight for safe gun runs, and rotor crews faced poor visibility and density altitude. Mortars were danger close here. Friendlies too near and elevation unforgiving. Math began to rule the fight as magazines lightened and seconds burned. Then a single suppressed crack lifted from the far ridge, quiet under the chaos. An enemy leaning to fire folded into dust, and the ravine paused to listen. Dawn settled over the mountains as the Rangers stepped into a ravine that looked simple on the map and complicated underfoot. The walls rose into twin ridgelines that created a natural kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. What felt like open country narrowed into a funnel. They moved in a wedge until the terrain pinched the file tighter than comfort allowed. At each SLLS halt, they listened to the wind, checked sectors, and read the ground the way you read a face that hides a lie. Silence said more than chatter. First, Lieutenant Mark Hensley kept orders short, so every word counted. Sergeant Alex Ramirez floated between elements, correcting spacing and reminding shooters that sector discipline saves lives when rocks and brush begin to trick the eye. The plan was simple enough to survive first contact. SPC. Kyle Newen carried the radio load with an ANPRC 152 slung high and an ANPRC 117 G ready for reach back. ComSec guarded their net like a locked door, which meant only their voices would live on it when things got hard. He marked likely line of sight pockets where a signal might escape the canyon later. SPC. Dana Brooks kept gloves ready and mind on march, rehearsing tourniquet, airway, breathing, and circulation before they were needed. She walked near the rear of the lead element, where a medic can sprint forward or fold back without crossing muzzles. Every step was a rehearsal for the worst. Rifles were standard and trusted. M4, A1 carbines rode with 30-round magazines seated tight. A single M240L provided the base of fire, and binoculars hung next to a waterproof grid map that would not quit in sweat or rain. The kit looked ordinary because ordinary works. The ground began to whisper that someone had been here with purpose. Spent brass winked from dusty pockets, and fighting positions looked down from angles that owned the floor. None of it shouted, but all of it aimed. Weather slid low and cool, promising ceilings that could box in aircraft later and damp air that could swallow radio reach. The path ahead tightened into choke points with poor egress and too many places to watch you walk. 10 meters more, and the ravine felt like a promise you should not keep. Rock crowded the ravine as the patrol funneled into the narrow tweet. The blast came from behind and rolled through the canyon like a hammer. An RPG-7 detonated, kicked a slide of stone, and slammed their exit shut with choking dust. Small arms snapped from both ridgelines and stitched the floor into a geometry of death. Crossfire overlapped from high angles and turned every step into risk. The kill zone was awake and hungry. First Lieutenant Mark Hensley pushed orders that cut through the noise. Hold position. Find real cover, not concealment. Helmets dropped and bodies slid to stone that stops bullets rather than brush that only hides shape. Sergeant Alex Ramirez led a fire team toward the right slope to steal a suppressive angle. The ridge answered with disciplined bursts that chipped rock and forced him back to ground that did not collapse under feet. He reset sectors with a flat hand and kept the team tight. A ranger folded with a leg wound before anyone saw the muzzle that sent it. SPC. Dana Brooks moved on instinct. Tourniquet, high and tight. Bleeding control confirmed. Airway and breathing checked. Circulation and head to toe reassessed by March. She tucked the casualty behind real cover and kept his world small. SPC. Kyle Nguyen lifted the antenna of his ANPRC 117G toward a slice of sky, while the ANPRC 152 sat ready on his chest. Terrain masking swallowed the call to the Tactical Operations Center and spat back white hiss. ComSec guarded their net so no outsider could bleed into it. The platoon shifted to ammo discipline that buys minutes. M4. A1 carbines spoke in controlled pairs, while the M240L threw short controlled bursts to pin helmets without wasting belts, then settled into sustained when the lane cooled. Target calls rolled by sector, so nothing doubled and nothing missed. Every rise of a helmet pulled a new string of impacts. Math began to lean against them as magazines lightened and options shrank to ground and grit. Then the valley held its breath, waiting for a change none of them could yet name. Smoke thinned and the noise settled into a pattern they could read. Close air support went off the table because the ceiling sat low and the valley was too tight for safe gun runs. Terrain masking hid approaches that fixed-wing crews need to survive. Attack helicopters were no rescue either. Visibility dropped in the folds of rock and density altitude chewed lift near the ridgelines. No pilot would risk a blind nose into a slot like this. Mortars sounded good until Math entered. Danger close in this terrain meant rough numbers that did not forgive. 80, 1 millimeter, around 200 meters. 20 millimeter, around 200 to 255. Friendlies and targets were closer than comfort, and elevation made error wider. First Lieutenant Mark Hensley kept the platoon on the floor and off the slopes. Pushing uphill blind would cut across crossing fires and bleed people into angles they could not see. The order was simple and clean. Hold position. Find cover. Confirm sectors. Rate of fire calmed to something that buys minutes. M4. A1. Carbine spoke in controlled pairs instead of panic strings, while the M240L surged into short controlled bursts only when a lane demanded pressure, then slid back to sustained. Brass slowed and thinking returned. SPC. Kyle Nguyen angled the ANPRC 117G to a pocket of sky and chased a clean path to the Tactical Operations Center. The canyon kept swallowing his voice and returning a soft hiss that said, "Keep trying." ComSec locked their net so only their traffic lived there. Rounds still chipped stone when helmets rose above cover. The clock moved and magazines felt lighter with every scan of hands and pouches. It became clear there would be no miracle, only discipline, skill, and a thin hope waiting for a name. She had been on the ridge since before the first foot hit gravel. Evelyn Cole carried the look of a retired sniper from the United States Army who never retired from discipline. Her hide sat roughly 300 meters above the kill zone, where two walls watched the floor. The ghillie was cut for rock and scrub, not grassland. Netting held shale dust and clipped stems that matched the palette of the slope. From 5 meters, she looked like another pocket of shadow. Her rifle was a bolt-action chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, a field twin to the M2010 ESR. A quality optic ran applied ballistics with a clean reticle for precise holds. A bipod planted the fore-end, and a suppressor capped the barrel with the point of impact shift recorded in her dope. Zero lived at 100 meters, where testing is honest. Elevation came from dialing the turret, and wind came from a measured hold. The Kestrel 5700 sat on a lanyard and told her what the air wanted to do. She watched for wind in ways no meter could see. Dust tails lifted and fell in the seams between boulders. Small grasses leaned, then stood again, as if breathing with the canyon. ComSec kept her off the platoon net, and she accepted that boundary. She had warned the Tactical Operations Center and the Battalion S3 over SATCOM and Iridium before sunrise. The route change request died on the way down the chain, and the patrol kept to plan. Now her updates traveled the same indirect path. She sent grids and short observations without asking for credit or control. The people on the floor owned the fight, and she would only give them space. Target precedence waited in the glass. The man with the RPG tube mattered first. Then the base of fire gunner who pulled the strings. Then the leader whose hands moved squads like pieces. She memorized where each would likely appear when pressure rose. Her motive was simple and heavy. Retired is not indifferent when the terrain tells the truth, and good people are walking into it. She knew what silence could save. Breath set the metronome for her body. 4 in. Hold. 6 out until the pulse settled and the reticle stopped floating. The chaos below became a problem of wind and angle. She checked her bubble level so the rifle stayed honest. She confirmed the last line in her dope and nudged elevation to match the slope and range. The stock touched her cheek, and she waited for the one quiet seam where a shot could change the day. Her cheek met the stock, and the world narrowed to reticle and breath. The bolt action in .300 Winchester Magnum settled into the bipod, and the suppressor turned thunder into a low cough. Zero lived at 100 meters. Elevation already dialed. Dust lifted and fell in tiny tails along the rocks. The Kestrel 5700 gave her a number, but the ground gave her truth. She watched for a brief lull and let the reticle rest, where an upper thoracic hit would stop a launch. The man with the RPG-7 leaned to set his tube. Bubble level centered. Dope confirmed. 4 in. Hold. 6 out. Press. He dropped hard behind his own cover, and the ridge stuttered. Confusion cracked the rhythm of the ambush. A figure with a radio hand signaled from the rear of a cluster. She held wind, adjusted a fraction, and sent another round that took the chest and stole the coordination. Hoses of fire searched for her and only found stone. A belt gun flashed from a shallow scrape, the base of fire trying to rebuild. She waited for another wind seam and placed a third round into the high chest. The recoil soft and the bolt cycling smooth. One shot, one problem removed guided every movement. She did not waste a round on suppression or on show. Each trigger press followed the same ritual of identification. Bubble check, dope check, breath, press. On the floor of the ravine, the Rangers felt the pause after each impact. Controlled pairs from M4, A1, S, and short controlled bursts from the M240L filled only what needed filling. Short bounds began to creep forward when the silence allowed it. She never touched the platoon net because ComSec kept it closed to outsiders. Earlier warnings had moved through the Tactical Operations Center and were finished. Now she read grass, dust, and mirage and let the rifle set a metronome the patrol could learn. The next pause after a distant crack felt like a green light. Sergeant. Alex Ramirez raised a hand and pushed his fire team forward 10 meters. They slid into real cover and kept muzzles low. The support element held the line. The M240L shifted from sustained fire to short controlled bursts that pinned helmets. When the lane cooled, it settled back into sustained to save belts. M4A, 1 carbines, spoke in clean, controlled pairs. Target calls rolled by sectors, so no one doubled a lane. The floor of the ravine began to feel organized. SP. Dana Brooks checked the casualty while the team moved. Bleeding remained controlled, and she confirmed a warm distal pulse. Her eyes tracked muzzles and backstops before every pull and drag. Another shot from the ridge carved a thin pocket of quiet. Ramirez used the seam and bounded the second team another 20 meters. They tucked behind stone that could stop bullets, not just hide shapes. First, Lieutenant Mark Hensley kept command tight and plain. He confirmed sectors, reminded everyone that cover is not concealment, and timed the next bound to the silence after each impact. Hands spoke more than words. The M240L punched short bursts only when heads rose. When nothing moved, it went back to a steady rhythm that kept options open. The gun team watched brass and kept barrels honest. Carbines stayed patient. Controlled pairs found only what needed to be found. No one chased noise or sprayed angles that did not belong to them. The pattern took hold like a song you remember. A shot from above. A bound of 10 meters. A reset behind rock, and another breath. Opposition fire lost its tempo and drifted wide. The unit felt distance opening between them and the worst of the kill zone. Hope returned as a practical thing, measured in small gains and good timing. The ridge started giving away small mistakes. A shoulder with a belt gun edged too far. Muzzle flash blinking from a scrape that had owned the floor minutes ago. Evelyn Cole let the sight settle and watched dust threads tell her the wind had eased. The Kestrel number matched what the grass was whispering. She checked the bubble level, confirmed the dope, and pressed for an upper thoracic hit at long range. The base of fire went quiet, and a lane opened like a held breath. A head lifted behind a rock with the posture of a spotter. He looked for control and found uncertainty. Her second round arrived where control had tried to stand. Movement tugged at the corner of her glass near an RPG tube. A fighter crawled to it with the confidence of someone who believed the canyon still belonged to him. She waited for a small lull and pinned the chest to the earth. Panic began to color the return fire. Bursts went wide, and bodies overexposed hips and elbows while trying to find a ghost that would not speak. Calls overlapped and showed more positions than they hid. Below, the Rangers held sector discipline like a rope line. M4A1S spoke only when a sector required it, and the M240L threw short controlled bursts that matched the moments after impact. Bounds happened only in the quiet she created. She never touched the platoon net. ComSec kept the network clean and her role simple. Earlier warnings had traveled through the Tactical Operations Center and were finished. Now she stayed on the glass and let patience do work. Each shot answered a specific problem and nothing more. The metronome effect grew as the pauses between enemy bursts stretched. Hunters began to act like prey in their own high ground. They searched for a fight they no longer directed and revealed fresh targets by trying to look. The silence lasted longer with every minute, setting the stage for a deliberate push. The ridgeline paused after a distant crack, and Sergeant Alex Ramirez took the seam. He pushed his fire team 10 meters to real cover and kept muzzles low. The movement felt measured and clean. The support element held firm along assigned sectors. The M240L eased from sustained fire into short controlled bursts that pinned helmets at the right moments. When lanes cooled, it slid back to sustained to save belts. Carbines kept to controlled pairs and let the terrain choose targets. Every bound honored sector discipline, so no one doubled a lane or left a gap. The ravine floor started to move like a plan instead of a reaction. A sudden pulse of fire flared from the left ridge. Ramirez called a peel, and the line folded back in perfect sequence, one element moving while the other covered. The M240L punched rapid for 10 to 15 seconds to break pressure and then breathed back to sustained. SPC. Dana Brooks guided the litter around rock and washouts. She kept march in mind with each step, checking tourniquet and breathing while watching backstops and muzzle angles. The casualty stayed stable as the team shifted ground. Another precise shot from the far slope carved a thin pocket of quiet. Ramirez used it to add 20 more meters and tucked his team behind stone that could stop bullets. The pattern of move and set took hold. SPC. Kyle Wynn lifted the antenna of the ANPRC 117G into a slit of sky and caught a brief path to the Tactical Operations Center. The note came back plain that exfil was inbound, with no promises beyond that. The canyon swallowed the window and returned to hiss. ComSec kept the platoon net clean, and Evelyn Cole never touched it. She stayed on glass, read the dust and grass, and chose the next moment to open a lane. Her timing made the bounds safe. By the time helmets cooled and lungs settled, the fight felt different. 10 meters. Then 10 more. The kill zone loosened its grip. Hope returned as distance measured in coordination, discipline, and good timing. The last enemy fighters bunched along the north ridge and tried to hold the high ground. Evelyn Cole read the angle and range as uphill at roughly 750 to 800 meters. She set her cheek and let the glass settle. Bubble level centered, while her dope confirmed what the slope demanded. She dialed elevation on the turret and built a wind hold from the Kestrel 5,700, then cross-checked it against dust, tails, and the lean of grass. Numbers met the ground truth. Breath made the metronome. 4 in. Hold. 6 out, until the reticle stopped wandering and the pulse no longer moved. The sight picture? She waited for a brief lull when the wind exhaled. The press was smooth, and the suppressor turned report into a low note. The round found the upper thoracic on a target easing from cover, and the bolt cycled without hurry. She watched for effect and saw shoulders fold. Return fire thinned as if someone bled the pressure from the ridge. A belt gun sputtered and quit, and spotters ducked into holes they had owned a minute ago. The canyon felt lighter by a measure you could hear. On the floor, First Lieutenant Mark Hensley raised a closed fist for hold. Weapons ready stayed the rule while every ranger swept sectors from solid cover. No one chased ghosts or left gaps. They waited for the trap inside the trap that never came. Sector discipline stayed tight and muzzles stayed honest. The only answers were small pebbles ticking down the slope. Silence took the valley like a switch turning. Wind replaced gunfire, and dust settled into seams where boots had scraped. The clock slowed, and the math that had punished them began to favor patience. This was not a cinematic headshot. It was a practical solution made real by 300 Winchester Magnum, a clean dial of elevation, and a steady wind hold. The initiative slid their way and stayed there through discipline and calm. Silence held the ravine long enough for dust to settle. A lone figure rose from the far slope and let her ghillie shrug off loose stems. The rifle hung safe across her chest, and her steps chose firm ground. First Lieutenant Mark Hensley raised a closed fist, and the platoon froze behind cover. Eyes stayed on sectors, while fingers found safeties and checked backstops. The approach stayed slow and deliberate. Challenge and reply rolled out by the book without drama. The answers matched and muzzles dipped just enough to show trust without losing caution. Distance remained controlled because good habits survive adrenaline. She came down the last stretch with muzzle awareness that never wavered. Evelyn Cole looked like a shadow given weight and purpose. The rifle stayed slung, and her hands stayed visible. She moved first to the casualty instead of introductions. Tourniquet high and tight. Bleeding control confirmed. Distal pulse warm beneath dusty gloves. She worked the march ladder with a steady rhythm that calmed the space around her. The ranger on the ground breathed easier, and the medic nodded. SPC. Dana Brooks reassessed vitals while the newcomer pointed to better cover for the litter. Small corrections made big comfort. Recognition passed through the platoon like a current. They understood the pattern of the day and who had set it. The relief felt simple and honest. Hensley stepped in close enough for normal voices. He asked for a name, and she answered with Overwatch, the way someone says a job. Not a title. Retired is not indifferent, lived in the way she stood and in the way she shared the moment. She offered no story and asked for none. Security stayed tight and sensitive details stayed off the field. Her eyes kept scanning sectors, even while still. The feeling that followed was a quiet kind of respect. A professional had walked out of the hills at the right time and done the right things. The ghillie settled against her back like a door closing, as the platoon prepared to learn what they could fix next. Evelyn Cole pulled a small waterproof card from a pocket and set it on a flat rock. The surface showed a clean grid with hand-drawn notes, arrows, and times. It looked like a range card built by someone who trusted pencil more than memory. She pointed to a marked break in the perimeter and traced how the line had folded. The sector labels showed where fields overlapped and where a blind seam had let movement slip through. Crossfire icons hinted at angles the enemy had owned. Next came the fixes, simple and specific. Shift this observation post 20 meters to gain a view of the choke point. Rotate sectors 5 degrees and tie the left element to a point of domination that watches the exit cut. She emphasized cover over concealment with a tap of a glove. Rocks that stop bullets beat brush that only hides shapes. A short note reminded them to confirm backstops before every peel. Her writing kept to what mattered and nothing more. Times marked when the enemy moved between positions and when the belt gun cooled. A small box listed recommended angles for interlocking fires if they had to cross the ravine again. She made it clear that the platoon net had stayed closed. ComSec kept her off the radio, and that was the right call. Earlier warnings had gone through the Tactical Operations Center by SATCOM and Iridium and were finished. First Lieutenant Mark Hensley accepted the card like a lesson plan. He listened without interrupting and asked only for the next step. She answered by returning to basics and letting the paper do most of the talking. He started to thank her for lives saved, and she waved it away. Discipline had held when it mattered, and she had simply created space to use training. The credit stayed with the people on the floor. The card felt heavier than it looked. Knowledge passed from one set of hands to another and settled into a checklist. Fix these points before the next patrol, and more people go home safe. The first hint of rescue arrived as a distant thump that grew into a measured beat. A UA-60M rode the wind down the valley while the crew scanned the ridgelines and held a safe height against gusts and tight rock walls. The rotor wash-braided dust into curtains. The platoon stayed in cover until the bird set a clean approach. Weapons sat on safe and muzzles tracked the ground, not the aircraft. First, Lieutenant Mark Hensley set the loading order with hand signals, so movement flowed without noise. SPC. Dana Brooks built a short 9-line Medevac while kneeling behind stone. She checked tourniquet and pressure dressing, confirmed breathing and distal pulse, then briefed the litter team over the engine noise. The casualty was ready to fly the moment skids bit. A crosswind kicked grit and stole vision near the pickup point. Ramirez called a brief peel to clear a lane as the air thickened with dust. The M-240L answered with short, controlled bursts, only when a real threat showed at the lip of a rock. The helicopter eased into the zone, and the crew chief waved them in. Rangers moved by file, hands on straps, eyes on backstops, boots quick over uneven ground. Belts, chins, and rucks found their places in a rhythm that did not waste a second. On the intercom, the pilot asked for the sniper who had steadied the day. The answer pointed toward the distant slope where Evelyn Cole folded her hide and brushed sign from stone with fieldcraft. ComSec had kept her off the platoon net, and she wanted no credit. She met Hensley near the last chalk with a small nod that said, "Enough." Then she turned uphill and vanished into rock and scrub inside 50 meters. As if the ground had closed over her. The door slid shut and the valley fell behind them in widening circles. As the cabin settled into the drone of flight, the feeling was relief wrapped in gratitude. A professional had appeared, made space for training, and left without ceremony. The ravine kept the echo while the lesson rode out with the men who would return. The bird lifted out and the valley fell behind them in a blur of rock and wind. Back at the patrol base, the story began to travel in quiet voices. People remembered how silence, not volume, had turned fear into focus. The lesson settled in deeper with every retelling. A single, patient cadence of shots reshaped a bad day, and discipline stitched the unit together when math tried to pull it apart. Success was counted in people who walked back in under their own power. SOP changed where it needed to. Route planning added hard checks to keep patrols from drifting into a known kill zone, with decision points mapped before boots moved. Teams pre-selected an observation post that actually saw the choke points and not just a pretty view. Radio preparation grew sharper as well. Patrols built a line-of-sight check into the timeline and rehearsed where an antenna could reach the tactical operations center if the canyon swallowed everything else. Exfil options were briefed with terrain notes instead of wishful thinking. Sector discipline tightened to match the ground. Elements adjusted crossfire and picked point-of-domination sites that watched likely approaches without walking into them. Cover beat concealment on the checklist, and every peel began with a glance at backstops. There was a reminder about close air support that felt both simple and hard to hear. When the ceiling sits low and the valley is narrow, aircraft cannot solve the fight you chose to enter. Planning assumed limits and wrote them into the scheme instead of hoping around them. Evelyn Cole became a kind of compass rather than a legend. ComSec kept her off the platoon net, and that was correct. Yet, her small card of grids and timings did more than a speech ever could. She asked for no credit and left the fix in their hands. What stayed was gratitude for a professional who appeared, made room for training, and stepped away. The respect extended to all the warriors you never see who keep people alive, by knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. One timely shot, one disciplined decision, or one small change in a plan can bend an entire day toward home.